How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Belle in Florida, John in Maine, Bill in mid-Missouri, Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in the Great Northwest, David in Indiana, Lucy in Minnesota, Karen in Northern California, Shandora in the Bronx, Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, as well as Aoife in Florida, Ella, Marjorie in Virginia, and Spencer in Connecticut. Welcome, everybody. Our daf is page 54 here in Tractate Bava, Kamma, 21st volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 5. Today, God willing, we'll finish our discussion of Mishnah number 7 and open Mishnah number 8. Quick announcement, as I mentioned yesterday, tomorrow, Wednesday, the 27th, Nina and I are scheduled to go to a wedding. So we'll have the class on the Friday schedule, meaning at noon Pacific. Noon Pacific class tomorrow. Okay. Enough said. So here we go. We pick it up at the bottom of page 53b. Regarding the pit, the Mishnah teaches if an ox and its accoutrements, i.e. the vessels that it was carrying, fell into the pit and the vessels were broken, or if a donkey and its accoutrements fell in and the accoutrements were torn, so the owner of the pit is liable for damage to the animal that was caused by the pit, but the owner of the pit is exempt from liability for damage caused to the vessels. And this is by explicit Torah law. It's written in the Torah. And the Gemara notes that the Mishnah, when it says this, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda obligates a person to pay for damage that was caused to vessels in cases of pit, the general category of pit. So the Gemara explains what is the reasoning of the rabbis, since the verse states, and an ox or a donkey fall therein, Exodus 21:33, it is inferred that it is specifically an ox, but not a person, for whose death the owner of the pit is liable. Moreover, one is liable for a donkey, but not for the vessels that the donkey might be carrying. And by contrast, Rabbi Yehuda expounds the word or in the expression an ox or a donkey to include the vessels. That's interesting. Like you might think, Rabbi Yehuda, what are you talking about? The verse said if an ox or a donkey falls in. Don't we need that conjunction or just to connect the ox and the donkey? How can you take an additional meaning, an additional law out of that expression and say that the or serves to include vessels, right? Whereas the majority say, as we're going to discuss in a moment, the majority say, look, the Torah says one is liable for the pit if the ox or the donkey falls in and is injured or dies. So we're talking about animals. We're not talking about things. So the Gemara asks, and how do the rabbis explain this word or, oi, that Rabbi Yehuda is using to expound an additional law that one is liable if his pit causes damage not only to the animal that falls in, but to the vessels or utensils the animal was carrying. So the rabbis would say that the word or in this expression is necessary to separate the cases of the ox and the donkey. And this indicates that if either an ox or a donkey falls in individually, the owner of the pit is liable. We don't have to wait until both kinds of animals fall in. And how does Rabbi Yehuda derive the law to separate the cases as the rabbis do? Well, he derives it from the use of the singular form of the verb. And an ox or a donkey fall, right? So fall, in this situation, the verb itself is in the singular. We can derive that from the syntax of the verb venafal. So indicating that he is liable even if only one animal falls. And the rabbis maintain that the term and fall, vinafal, can also and fault can also indicate many animals, as the use of the singular form of a verb does not prove that the subject is necessarily singular. So the Gemara now challenges both opinions. And we are on page 54a now. So say that the term and fall, v'nafal, is a generalization, whereas the phrase an ox or a donkey is a detail. So according to the principles of halachic exegesis, when the Torah presents a generalization and a detail, so what we learn from that is that the generalization includes only what is contained in the detail. Therefore, an ox and a donkey are indeed included, but anything else is not included. So the sages said, meaning not utensils or vessels. We are going to learn out that other kinds of animals would be included. So the sages said in response the following verse: the owner of the pit shall pay, meaning the following verse in the Torah, right? We just read 21:33, now we're talking about 21:34. The owner of the pit shall pay means that the Torah generalized again. So the verses are structured according to the principles of exegesis for a generalization, followed by a detail, followed by a generalization. And according to this principle, you may deduce that the verses are referring only to the items that are similar to the detail. So in this case, just as the explicit detail is referring to animals, so too, all items included in the generalization must be animals, to the exclusion of utensils and vessels. So the Gemara now challenges this answer. If so, just as the explicit detail, i.e. the ox and the donkey, is referring to items whose carcass renders a person ritually impure by contact or carrying, so too all items, i.e. all animals, whose carcass renders a person ritually impure through contact or carrying, should be included in the laws of damage classified by pit, the general category pit. But birds, although they are animals, the Torah distinguishes them from other kinds of animals in that the carcasses of birds do not render a person ritually impure through contact or carrying, so therefore they should not be included in this law. And the Gemara answers, if so, the merciful one, if so, let the merciful one write only one detail from which the exclusion of birds could be derived. And the Gemara asks, well, which detail should the Torah write? If it writes only an ox, I would say that an item that is sacrificed on the altar, such as an ox or a sheep or a goat, so I would say that only an ox, if it writes only an ox, I would say that an item that is sacrificed on the altar, like an ox or a sheep or a goat, indeed renders the owner of the pit liable if it falls into his pit. Whereas an item that is not sacrificed on the altar, like a horse or a donkey, does not render him liable. And if the merciful one writes only a donkey, I would say those animals whose firstborn is sanctified, such as a donkey, as described in the Torah at Exodus 13:13, would indeed render the owners of the pit liable if the animal falls in, but animals whose firstborn is not sanctified do not render them liable. Therefore, the Torah states both an ox and a donkey to, sort of make the list include, by extension, more categories of animals than it would otherwise. So the original difficulty, therefore, resurfaces. Why is the verse not expounded as a generalization, a detail, and a generalization, thereby excluding birds? So rather, the previous method of deriving liability for a pit must be rejected, and instead it should be derived in a different way, like this. The verse states, and the carcass shall be for him, at Exodus 21:34, from which it may be inferred that anything subject to death is included. This would exclude vessels and utensils. And the Gemara asks, if this is the basis of for liability for a pit, then both according to the rabbis who exclude vessels from liability based on another verse, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, who has amplified the law to include vessels, whether according to the rabbis or according to Rabbi Yehuda, one could ask, are vessels subject to death? Clearly, vessels cannot be subject to death. Why then is a separate source necessary to derive their halakhic status? And the sages said in reply, vessels may also be considered subject to death in the sense that their shattering is tantamount to the death of the vessel. So the Gemara continues to challenge this explanation. But according to Rav, who says, with regard to pit, for which the Torah deems a person liable, it is only for damage caused by its fumes, meaning if an animal or a person suffocates while in the pit, but not for damage caused by the impact of the fall. That's the minority opinion in Rav versus Shmuel. Shmuel holds that one is liable whether the person is injured through suffocation or impact, and that is the law. But right now we're making the discussion according to Rav, right, where he says only damage caused by the lack of air in the pit is the kind of damage for which the owner of the pit is liable, not for damage caused by the impact of the fall. So according to Rav, the following question may be raised, both according to the rabbis and according to Rabbi Yehuda. Are vessels capable of being broken by fumes such that a verse is necessary to exclude them? And the sages said in reply, there is such a case concerning new vessels which crack from fumes that might be found in a pit. And the Gemara asks further, but isn't this verse, and the carcass shall be for him, necessary for that which Rava ruled? As Rava says, with regard to a disqualified consecrated ox that fell into a pit, and what's important about that is that it doesn't have an owner, legally speaking. The owner of the pit is exempt, right? Because the ox doesn't belong to someone. It is a disqualified consecrated ox. So then the owner of the pit is exempt, as it is stated, and the carcass shall be for him. And since no one can take that carcass because it was consecrated, it can't belong to anyone, and therefore the laws of the pit don't apply. And it is referring to a person to whom the carcass belongs, thereby excluding this person to whom the carcass does not belong. So once a law has already been derived from this verse, it cannot be used as the basis for deriving a second law. So rather, the laws of liability for pit must be derived from another source. And the verse states concerning the category of pit, he shall recompense money to its owners. At Exodus 21:34, thereby including any item that has an owner within the scope of liability. And the Gemara challenges this answer. Well, if so, then even vessels and people should be included as well, which presents a difficulty for all opinions. And the Gemara answers, this is why the verse states an ox, but not a person, a donkey, but not vessels. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, who amplifies the scope of liability to include vessels, granted that the term an ox is necessary as he excludes people based on it, for which he is not liable, the idea being that a person has agency and should be able to avoid falling into a pit and dying there. So a person is not liable for the death of a person who falls into his pit, although he is liable for the person's injuries. But with regard to the term a donkey, what does he include based on it? How does Rabbi Yehuda use this term to exclude something if he already includes vessels? And rather, Rava said the term donkey stated with regard to the category of pit, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and the term sheep in Deuteronomy 22 verse 1 stated with regard to a lost item, according to the opinion of everyone, are difficult. There is no explanation why these words are included in the Torah if you're going along with the view of Rabbi Yehuda. The rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda don't have this problem. Now, the Mishna teaches, if a cheresh ox or a shote ox or a katan ox fell into the pit, the owner of the pit is liable. And the Gemara clarifies what is meant by the phrase a cheresh ox or a shote ox or a katan ox. If we say that it means an ox belonging to a deaf mute, cheresh, or an ox belonging to an imbecile, shote, or an ox belonging to a minor, katan, then it can be inferred that if it was an ox belonging to a halachically competent adult, the owner of the pit would be exempt. What would be the reason for this exemption? And Rabbi Yochanan says we don't make that exemption. Instead, it should be interpreted as an ox that is itself impaired by being deaf, or an ox that is itself impaired by being an imbecile, or an ox that is very young. Right? Normally we talk about the deaf mute, the minor, or the imbecile as being not halakhically competent humans. But it seems that here, at least according to the view of Rabbi Yochanan, we can actually ascribe these traits to an ox. Right? That in other words, that an ox that can't hear, or an ox that somehow had a brain injury, or an ox that is very young, is going to be more susceptible to certain kinds of injury, like falling into a pit, than a mature and normally abled ox. Now we're on page 54b. And the Gemara asks, but can it be inferred that if an ox that is of ordinary intelligence fell into a pit, that the owner of the pit would be exempt? We're just talking about if an animal, an ox or a donkey, falls into my pit, then I'm liable if the ox or the donkey is injured, because I made a pit or I left a pit, in the public domain where it created a hazard for passersby. Are you now saying that only applies if the ox was somehow disabled, and that's why it fell into my pit? But if it was an ordinary ox that fell into my pit, then I'm exempt, even though I left this hazardous hole in the public domain? Is that what we're saying? And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, the Mishnah is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary, meaning, it is not necessary to state that if an ox that is of standard intelligence fell into a pit, that the pit's owner is liable. We know that. But with regard to an ox that is deaf and imbecile or very young, say that it was not due to the pit alone that it fell in, but rather that its deafness caused it to fall in, or its young age caused it to fall in, and the owner of the pit should be exempt. Therefore, this is teaching us, I guess Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us that nevertheless the owner of the pit is liable. Sure, you're liable if an ordinary ox falls in, and you're also liable if these oxes with limited abilities fall in as well. So Rav Acha said to Ravina, but isn't it taught in a baraisa? If a living being that is mentally competent fell into a pit, the owner is exempt. What, is it not referring to an ox that is mentally competent? And Ravina said to him, no, it is referring to a person. And Rav Acha challenges this response. If that is so, you should then infer that it is only for the injuries of a person who is mentally competent that he is exempt. But if one is not mentally competent, is the law that he would be liable? But the term an ox is written in the Torah as causing liability and not a person. So Rabbah responded to Rav Acha, rather, what does the term mentally competent mean? It is referring to a species that is mentally competent and thereby includes all humans in the exemption from liability of the owner of the pit if a human falls in and dies. And Rav Acha said to him, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, if an ox that was mentally competent fell inside the pit, he is exempt from liability? So rather, Rava said that Rabbi Yirmiyah's explanation should be rejected. And the Mishna is referring specifically to an ox that is deaf, an ox that is an imbecile, and an ox that is very young, for which he is liable. But for an ox that is of standard intelligence, the owner of the pit is exempt. And what is the reason? The reason is that the ox should have looked carefully while walking. If it did not, it is responsible for its own injury. Right? If an ox just walks into a wall, that would be very surprising. Right? Was it somehow negligent to build a building alongside the public domain? No. So if the ox walks into your building, that would be very weird. And therefore, the person wouldn't be liable for having a wall, that abuts the public domain. Now, what about the pit? Are we saying that a normal ox is not going to fall into a pit because it will see the hole and walk around it? That seems to be what Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying. So the Gemara notes that idea of Rabbi Yirmiyah is also taught in a baraisa with regard to an ox that is deaf and imbecile or very young. blind, or that is walking at night and unable to see, if it fell into a pit, the pit's owner is liable. But if the ox is of standard intelligence or is walking during the day, the pit's owner is exempt, since normal behavior for oxen is that ordinarily they watch where they are going and avoid pits. Right? So it's interesting that he is liable if animals fall into his pit because he left this pit in the public domain. But he may not always be liable in case there's a contributing factor. And a contributing factor would be that an ordinary ox that would normally walk around the hole didn't walk into this hole, and we don't know why, right? So, it did, okay, the ox, blew it. And so the person is exempt in that case. But that doesn't mean you should feel free to leave holes in the public domain, because you never know when an ox is going to be walking there at night, or a young ox, or a deaf ox, or something like that. And if they fall into your hole, then you certainly are liable. Now, that's according to that baraisa. Where did the law end up on this? One is not liable for the death of an animal that fell into his pit unless the animal suffered from an impairment that renders it incapable of avoiding a pit. Or if an ordinary ox fell at night, if a mentally competent ox fell in the pit during the day, the pit's owner is exempt. That is the law. Wait a minute. Fell during the day. The pit's owner is exempt, since the animal should have looked where it was going, as most animals do. Now, with regard to compensation for damage, he is liable in any case where an animal falls into his pit. So it's not that he, has this big blanket exemption. Most of the time, an animal that falls into your pit is not going to die from it. It's only going to be injured. And any injury of an animal that falls into your pit, you are liable for. But when we're talking about the death of an animal, which is a much more extreme, and costly type of liability, we're going to say that if an average animal that's walking during the day fell into your pit, it shouldn't have fallen into your pit. That was a weird occurrence, and so you're not liable for its death. But if even an animal of ordinary intelligence falls into your pit at night, you are liable. Did I finish that? Not a person. Wait a minute, where was I? No. What? So let's just go back where we are. So Rava responded to Rav Acha. Rather, what does the term mentally competent mean? It is referring to a species that is mentally competent and thereby includes all humans in the exemption from liability. And Rav Acha said to him, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, if an ox that was mentally competent fell inside it, he is exempt? And rather, Rava said that Rabbi Yirmiyahu's explanation should be rejected, and the Mishna is referring specifically to an ox that is deaf, an ox that is an imbecile, and an ox that is very young, for which he is liable. But for an ox of standard intelligence, he is exempt. And what is the reason? The reason is that the ox should have looked carefully while walking. If it did not, it is responsible for its own injury. And the Gemara notes, that idea is also taught in a baraisa with regard to an ox that is deaf, an imbecile, young or blind, or that is walking at night and unable to see. If it fell into a pit, the pit's owner is liable. But if the ox is of standard intelligence or is walking during the day, the pit's owner is exempt. Since normal behavior for oxen is that ordinarily they watch where they are going and avoid pits. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. Here comes Mishnah number 8. The law, the halacha, is the same whether concerning an ox or whether concerning any other animal with regard to the liability for falling into a pit, and with regard to keeping its distance from Mount Sinai at the time of the receiving of the Torah, when it was forbidden for any animal to ascend the mountain, and with regard to the payment of double the principal by a thief, and with regard to the mitzvah of returning a lost item, and with regard to unloading its burden, and with regard to the prohibition of muzzling it while threshing, and with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, and with regard to the prohibition against its working on Shabbos. Right, so the idea is that animals are mentioned in these other kinds of laws. Even the historical law of no animal shall approach the mountain when God appeared at Mount Sinai. And if only an ox was mentioned, what this Mishnah says is, well, ox was mentioned as the example, but this applies to all other animals equally. And similarly, undomesticated animals and birds are subject to the same laws as domesticated animals. So if so, why are all of the above laws stated in the Torah only in reference to an ox or a donkey? So rather, the reason is that the verse speaks of a common scenario from which the other cases may be derived. And so the general principle is just because it says ox or donkey doesn't mean that that law is limited to only oxen and donkeys unless there's a reason to believe that. Absent such a reason, that law is just using the ox or the donkey as an example, and we can extend the law to other kinds of animals. That's the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara. The Gemara explains the sources for all the laws enumerated in our Mishnah that apply to all animals. So with regard to falling into a pit, it is written, he shall recompense money to its owners, which means that any animal that has owners is included, as we mentioned on page 54a. Earlier today. With regard to the requirement that animals keep their distance from Mount Sinai before the giving of the Torah, this is derived from the verse, whether it be an animal or person, it shall not live, at Exodus 19:13. And an undomesticated animal, which is a chaya, is also included in the term animal, here behema. So generally behema is a domesticated animal and chaya is an undomesticated animal. And in addition, the word whether, whether, serves to include birds. Now let's just pause for a second. It's very interesting. This is a law, this is a halacha, that when God, told Moses to tell the Jewish people gathered around Mount Sinai a short time after leaving slavery in Egypt, that the Lord is going to appear to all of you. Some say there were 2 million people there, some say 3 million. And, God told Moses to tell the people, be prepared. It's going to happen on the third day, meaning the day after tomorrow. Today's the first day, tomorrow's the second. The day after tomorrow is the third day. Men should not, have relations with their wives during this period to be ready. And also the mountain itself, nobody should be on the mountain lest they die, right? It was, caution, hazardous. When God is appearing on Mount Sinai, anyone who gets too close will just, be vaporized or be overwhelmed or be nullified. They will not survive that experience because what is God? God is everywhere. We're in God. The whole earth is in God. The whole universe is within God. But God sent some kind of a manifestation of God's self on that day, such that it would be dangerous for any creature to be on that mountain. So, okay, that's a historical fact. I believe it is a historical fact. For the purposes of this discussion, it's a historical fact, right? Not an ongoing law. I mean, when is the next time that God is appearing at Mount Sinai to give the Torah? Our understanding is that even when Mashiach comes, we're not going to have that event because the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. So why would we interpret, God's command on that day as applying to all animals, not just the example that was given? What difference does it make, right? How is that law is not going to be applied in other contexts because it was absolutely unique on the greatest day in the history of the world. Answer, okay, but it's in the Torah. And we can learn out from that example by comparing it to other examples where, the word animal or the word ox or the word donkey is used. What does it mean? And that is good enough for the sages to make that exploration. Now, With regard to the double payment of a thief, it is, as we say in the halakhic exegesis of the verse at Exodus 22:8, for any matter of trespass, that it is a general statement which includes any matter of negligence, right? So it's a thief who is caught and doesn't of his own free will return the object that he stole. So when he's caught, he's going to have to make restitution, not only of what he stole, but the double payment, right? It's going to have to restore double what he took because he shouldn't have stolen. So now with regard to the mitzvah of returning a lost item, and in all these cases, right, an animal is mentioned, so that if you stole a sheep, you're going to have to return either 2 sheep or the value of 2 sheep. Now, with regard to the mitzvah of returning a lost item, the verse states comprehensively, for every lost thing of your brother. That's Deuteronomy 22:3. With regard to the laws of unloading a burden, derive it from again, we're deriving that even though it only mentioned one animal, an ox or a donkey, that this would apply to all animals, whether it was an animal that was stolen or an animal that was lost and needs to be returned, or that your animal shall not be worked, right? Your domesticated animal that is a plowing animal, for example, or an animal that you ride, you're not going to do that on Shabbos. And that applies to all animals that you might, not just your ox or your donkey. So with regard to the laws of unloading a burden, derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbos, as the word donkey is employed in the context of unloading a burden, and the word donkey is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos. And that verse is clearly referring to any animal, not just a donkey. Now, with regard to the prohibition against muzzling an animal, that when your animal is turning the grindstone in your mill, so there's food that the animal would like to eat while it's working, so you shall not muzzle the animal while it's threshing for you. It seems like, if you're going to show that kind of sensitivity and kindness to an animal, how much more so to your fellow human being? But let's keep going. With regard to the prohibition against muzzling an animal, mentioned in the verse, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. Derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbos, as the word ox is employed in the context of muzzling, and the word ox is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor for him on Shabbos. And that verse is clearly referring to any animal. With regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, if it is referring to the prohibition against using diverse kinds for plowing, that you wouldn't put an ox and a horse next to each other pulling a plow, or an ox and a donkey, due to which it is forbidden to plow with an ox and a donkey together. See Deuteronomy 22:10. And you might say there's logic to that, but that is the kind of law like Kilayim, that you shall not plant diverse kinds in the vineyard, which is understood to be a hook, right? It's not a rational law. It's a supra-rational law. We do it because God said so. We don't really understand why, but there's certain laws that he gave us. Their effect of those laws is it makes us a distinct people who end up having to, often live separately, eat separately, maintain our distinctness, while living, in a broader culture that is not the Jewish people. And that, you might say that that's the purpose of the chukim, these laws that we don't really understand them on a rational level. But the bottom line is we don't understand them on a rational level, and we just do it because God said so. So with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, if it is referring to the prohibition against using diverse kinds of plowing, then derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbos, as the word ox is employed in the context of plowing with diverse kinds, and the word ox is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos. And if, when we're talking about diverse kinds, it is referring to the prohibition of diverse kinds for crossbreeding, that we don't breed different species together, derive it from a verbal analogy from the context of Shabbos, as the term your cattle is employed in the context of crossbreeding animals at Leviticus 19:19, and the term your cattle is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos. And the verse is clearly referring to any animal. So the Gemara asks, and from where do we derive concerning Shabbos itself that the words ox and donkey are referring not just to ox and donkey, but to all types of animals? You keep saying, well, in the Shabbos context, it's obvious that it applies to all animals. How do you know that? As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yosef says, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, in the first version of the Ten Commandments, right? So this Shabbos, we're going to be finishing the Torah portion is the final portion in the book of Bereshit, Genesis. And then next week we start reading the book of Exodus, or Shemos in Hebrew. And in that book, we will read the Ten Commandments, right? When the Ten Commandments are given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments will be repeated in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, near the end of Moses' life, when he's giving his final month-long sermon to the children of Israel before they enter the promised land, and he goes off to die alone on the mountain because God wouldn't let him enter the promised land with the children of Israel. And why is it important that the Ten Commandments are given twice in the Torah? Because there are subtle differences between the Ten Commandments given the first time and the second time, and our sages learn out laws from those subtle differences. So here we go. Now we're talking about Right. So the Gemara asks, but why not say that the verses be expounded as follows? The term cattle, which is used in the first version of the ten. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I was up here. And from where do we derive concerning Shabbos itself that the words ox and donkey are referring not just to ox and donkey, but to all types of animals? As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yosef says, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, in the first version of the Ten Commandments, it is stated, your manservant, your maidservant, right, your male or female slave, nor your cattle are going to be permitted to perform work for you on Shabbos. Whereas in the second version of the Ten Commandments, at Deuteronomy 5:14, it is stated, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle. Now, aren't an ox and a donkey already included in the category of all animals, which are included in the term cattle? Why then were they specified? To teach you that just as with regard to the terms ox and donkey that are stated here, undomesticated animals and birds have the same law as them, so too, everywhere that an ox and a donkey are mentioned, all types of undomesticated animals and birds have the same laws as them. And the Gemara asks, but why not say that the verses could be expounded like this? The term cattle, used in the first version of the Ten Commandments, is a generalization, and the phrase your ox and your donkey, used in the latter version of the Ten Commandments, is a detail. And in the case of a generalization and a detail, the principles of exegesis dictate that the generalization includes only what is specified in the detail. Therefore, with regard to this subject, an ox and a donkey should indeed be included, but anything else should not be included. And the sages said in reply, in the phrase, nor any of your cattle, stated in the latter version of the Ten Commandments, following the phrase, your ox and your donkey, it then generalized again. Therefore, the verse is structured as a generalization, a detail, and a generalization. And according to our principle of exegesis, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Consequently, just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as animals, so too all items included in the general term must be animals. And the Gemara challenges this answer, but say instead that just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as an item, i.e. an animal, whose carcass renders a person ritually impure through contact or through carrying, so too all items whose carcass renders a person ritually impure through contact or through carrying should be included. But birds, whose carcasses do not render a person ritually impure through contact or carrying, should not be included, right? So if you have birds that do work for you, perhaps that bird could do the work on Shabbos. You could have a parrot that turns the lights on and off for you, and that would be okay on Shabbos, according to this view. But the sages said in reply, if so, let the merciful one write only one detail from which this could be derived. And the Gemara asks, which detail should the merciful one write? If the merciful one writes only an ox, I would say an animal that is sacrificed on the altar, such as an ox, indeed renders the owner of the pit liable, whereas an animal that is not sacrificed on the altar does not render him liable. And if the merciful one writes only a donkey, I would say an animal whose firstborn is sanctified, such as a donkey, as described in the Torah at Exodus 13:13, does indeed render him liable, but an animal whose firstborn is not sanctified does not render him liable. Therefore, the merciful one writes both an ox and a donkey. Consequently, there is no redundancy, and each detail is required for correctly deriving other laws. So if so, the previous question resurfaces. Why are the verses not expounded such that the prohibition does not include birds? So rather, the term nor any, vechol, of your cattle should be understood as an amplification, encompassing any item that is even partially similar to the detail. So the Gemara says, but is it the case that anywhere that the merciful one states the word any, which is how we're translating call, it is intended as an amplification, but concerning tithes, where it is written any, call, and yet we expound the verses with the method of generalization and detail, rather than using the method of amplification and restriction. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa concerning the second tithe money brought to Jerusalem, that the verse states, and you shall give the money for anything, bechol, that your soul desires, which is a generalization followed by for oxen or for sheep or for wine or for strong drink. That's the detail. And it concludes with, or for anything, vechol, that your soul asks of you, where it then generalized again. Therefore, the verse is structured as a generalization, detail generalization. According to the principles of exegesis, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Consequently, just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as produce of produce, i.e. they grow from a parent organism, such as agricultural produce or animals, and they are grown from the ground, i.e. their sustenance comes from the ground, so too it includes all things that are the produce of produce and are grown from the ground. It is evident from here that the method of generalization and a detail used in connection with the term call, as opposed to interpreting it, it is evident from here that the method of generalization and a detail is used in connection with the term call, as opposed to interpreting it using amplification, generalization, detail is not synonyms of amplification, restriction. Generalization, detail will produce one result and is one method of interpretation, and amplification, restriction will produce a different result and is a different method of interpretation. So the sages said in response, a distinction may be drawn between the term for anything, bechol, which is a generalization, and the term any, kol, as in any of your cattle, which is an amplification. And if you wish, say instead that the word any, kol, is a generalization as well, in addition to for anything, bechol. But this word, any, written here is an amplification. And this is the case since it could have written and your cattle, as it is written in the first version of the Ten Commandments. But instead, it writes nor any of your cattle. Learn from this that it is an amplification and encompasses other animals as well. Don't get too hung up on the details here. Right? What we're understanding is how did the sages derive that where the Torah only mentioned ox or donkey, that this applies to all other animals as well, unless there's a reason to not make that application. Now the Gemara continues to analyze this matter. Now that you have said that the term any, kol, is an amplification, why do I need the words your cattle, stated in the first version of the Ten Commandments, and the terms an ox or a donkey, stated in the second version of the Ten Commandments? The phrase and any of your cattle already includes any animal. And the sages said in response, each of these terms is required. The term ox can be used to derive the law with regard to the prohibition against muzzling, as the word ox is employed in the context of muzzling, and the word ox is employed in the context of prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos, which is included in the Ten Commandments. And the term donkey can be used to derive the law with regard to the law of unloading a burden, as the word donkey is employed in the context of unloading a burden. See Exodus 23:5. And the word donkey is employed in the context of prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos. So in other words, it was included in the Ten Commandments so that it could be linked to other laws in other parts of the Torah. I'm almost done. If you got questions or comments, please get them in now. And the terms your cattle can be used to derive the law with regard to the prohibition of diverse kinds, as the term your cattle is employed in the context of crossbreeding animals at Leviticus 19:19, and the term your cattle is employed in the context of the prohibition against having one's animal perform labor on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, if so, that this redundancy is the source for extending the prohibition of diverse kinds, then it should be prohibited even for a person to plow together with an ox or an other animal. Why then did we learn in a Mishna in Tractate Kilayim that it is permitted for a person to plow and pull with any of them? A person can help pull the plow alongside an ox or a donkey, but an ox and a donkey cannot pull the plow alongside each other. Why then did we learn in the Mishnah that it is permitted for a person to plow alongside with an animal? And Rav Papa said the sages of Papunya know the reason for this matter. And who are these sages? Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who resided in Papunya. And the reason is that the verse states, you shall not perform any labor, neither you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maidservant, your ox, your donkey, any of your animals, or the stranger residing within your city gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you, at Deuteronomy 5:14. As if to say, I have equated people with animals only concerning resting on Shabbos, but not with regard to this other matter, or any other matter, right? People are not equivalent to animals at all, except in the sense that on Shabbos, we all rest. You and all the animals that you own, on your farm or ranch, let's say. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at noon, right? Tomorrow's class, a special time, noon Pacific, because Nina and I are going to a wedding. Okay, I've got just a few questions here on Bava Kamma 54. Joseph, was this generalization and detail principle from Rabbi Yishmael, or was this from a later generation? I mean, it's listed in the Siddur, right, in a prayer book, as Rabbi Yishmael's 13 principles. Is it 13? It is 13, right? Isn't it? We read them every morning. Although a lot of people read over them very quickly. But you should read them. And then right after that, we pray for the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. Right? So Rabbi Yishmael says the Torah is expanded by means of 13 rules. Right, so it's also 13 attributes of God later. But yes, 13 rules of Rabbi Yishmael. And one of them definitely is this generalization, detail, and then generalization. There are other systems of halakhic interpretation. There's not only Rabbi Yishmael's 13 rules. And so these other systems that are listed elsewhere and that other sages use to derive laws here and there, I don't know if they include this same principle or not. So I don't really know. Did Rabbi Yishmael sort of, compile these principles? I don't think he invented them. I think he just compiled them and listed them with great clarity as saying that these are the 13 that are definitive and that we can use, and that other people who use other systems that have also existed for a while, they shouldn't be using those, that these are the 13 we use. But who wrote it? I'm not sure. Who came up with it? As a matter of fact, I'm not sure. But I'm guessing that in terms of, where did these principles actually come from? I mean, they might go all the way back to Sinai because, if it's saying like this is the principles by which the sages can, derive laws that are not written explicitly in the Torah, but which then acquire the force of law, that's taking on a lot to invent such a principle. So I'm not sure, but maybe these principles go back all the way to Mount Sinai and were part of those core ideas and laws that God gave to Moses and said, here's the written Torah and here's the oral Torah that you're going to need to keep, the Torah sort of supple, and able to be applied no matter what novel situation comes up in the future. Lucy, I am curious about how the mental competence of an ox or other animal was determined. Does the Talmud deal with that somewhere? I mean, looking here in the notes, what they were saying is, it's not like there's some kind of IQ test, right? But if an animal had a disease, right, that left it like, where it was stumbling around and clearly not normal, that would be like a mentally incompetent ox. Or if it, got hit in the head and it's clearly not able to walk in a straight line or doesn't act in a normal way as a result of that injury, that's what we're talking about. So we're not going to make distinctions between a particularly bright ox and an average ox. We're just talking about, was it brain damaged or not? So Lynn mentioned Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, which is what we say God is the true judge when we hear of a death. That head Rabbi Chaim Herzl Krantz of Ahavas Yisrael in Silver Spring Jewish Center of Maryland just passed, and he is being buried in Jerusalem. May the Neshama have a great Aliyah, and may his memory always be for a blessing. We say amen. Thank you for mentioning that. That's what I've got for us today. So with God's help, we're going to get tomorrow again. Noon Pacific. The Friday schedule we're going to apply tomorrow, Wednesday, since Nina and I will not be available at 6 p.m. Pacific, our normal Wednesday time. Have a great night.